There is a moment in the history of World War II that changed everything. Not a battle, not an invasion. A single decision made by a single man in a frozen basement in a destroyed city in the middle of a Russian winter. A decision that Hitler called the greatest betrayal in German military history. A decision that cost one man everything he had spent his entire life building. And a decision that, depending on how you look at it, was either the ultimate act of cowardice or the first moment of genuine clarity in a career built on obedience to a monster. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus walked out of the basement of a destroyed department store in Stalingrad and surrendered to the Soviet army. He was the first German field marshal in history to be taken prisoner. He had 91,000 surviving men with him. He had been promoted to field marshal by Hitler just 2 days earlier, a promotion that was essentially a message. Field marshals do not surrender. They die. Hitler was telling Paulus to shoot himself. Paulus did not shoot himself. And everything that followed from that decision, the captivity, the transformation, the broadcasts against Hitler, the testimony at Nuremberg, makes Friedrich Paulus one of the most complicated and most fascinating figures of the entire war. Friedrich Paulus was born on September 23, 1890, in Breitenau, a small town in Hesse. He came from a modest background. His father was a bookkeeper, not a military officer, not a nobleman, not someone with connections to the Prussian military aristocracy that dominated the German officer corps. Paulus got where he got through ability, through diligence, through the kind of careful, methodical competence that makes a man indispensable as a staff officer, even if it never quite makes him magnetic as a commander. He entered the military before World War I, served through that conflict, survived it, and was selected for the small post-war Reichswehr, the 100,000-man army that Germany was allowed under Versailles. Selection meant quality. Paulus was good at his job. He was precise, thorough, excellent at the detailed planning work that staff officers do, the logistics, the coordination, the translation of strategic objectives into operational orders. Through the 1930s, Paulus rose steadily through the staff system. He was not a frontline commander in the style of Guderian or Rommel. He was a planner, a coordinator, an organizer. He was the kind of officer who made things work behind the scenes while more charismatic men got the glory. He served as chief of staff to various formations, and by 1940 he was deputy chief of the Army General Staff, one of the most senior planning positions in the entire Wehrmacht. In that role, he was involved in the planning for Operation Barbarossa. He helped design the invasion of the Soviet Union, the plan that would eventually swallow his entire army and end his career was partly his own work. In January 1942, Paulus was given command of the 6th Army, one of Germany's most powerful field formations. It was his first major field command. He was 51 years old. He had spent his career in staff positions and was now being asked to lead an entire army in the most brutal war in human history. The 6th Army in 1942 was part of the Great German Summer Offensive, Case Blue, the drive into southern Russia toward the Caucasus and the oil fields that Hitler believed Germany needed to win the war. The plan split German forces in 2 directions simultaneously, south toward the oil and east toward Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad was not originally the primary objective. It was a communications hub, a transport center, a city that bore Stalin's name and therefore had symbolic significance. But as the summer of 1942 progressed, it became an obsession. For Hitler, who could not accept that a city bearing his enemy's name would remain uncaptured, and for Stalin, who ordered it held at any cost. Paulus drove his 6th Army into Stalingrad in September 1942, and then the battle began, one of the most brutal in human history. Not the sweeping armored maneuver of the early war, house to house, floor to floor, room to room, men fighting with knives and entrenching tools in spaces too small to use a rifle. The city was systematically destroyed and then fought over in the rubble. By November 1942, the Sixth Army had nearly taken the city. It controlled most of it, but it was exhausted, stretched thin, its flanks held by Romanian and Italian Allied forces that were far less capable than the German units at the center. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive on both flanks simultaneously. The Romanian armies collapsed almost immediately. Within 4 days, the two Soviet pincers met at Glantz, west of Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was completely encircled. What happened next defined everything about Friedrich Paulus. His generals urged him to break out immediately, to drive west through the Soviet encirclement before it solidified, before the ring became impossible to break. Paulus hesitated. He asked Hitler for permission. Hitler told him to hold. Goering promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air, a promise that was almost immediately revealed to be completely impossible to keep. A relief operation was launched under Manstein, but stalled 48 kilometers from the pocket. The window for breakout closed. The pocket shrank. The food ran out. The ammunition ran out. The temperature dropped to -40. Men were dying of starvation, of frostbite, of wounds that couldn't be treated because there were no medical supplies. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was no longer a fighting force. It was 300,000 men waiting to die in a frozen city. Paulus repeatedly asked Hitler for permission to surrender. Hitler repeatedly refused. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal on January 30th, the day before the surrender, with the clear implication that a Field Marshal should die rather than be taken prisoner. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was counting on Paulus to maintain that record. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet forces reached the basement of the Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, where Paulus had established his final headquarters. He was found sitting on a cot, unshaven, wearing a simple greatcoat with no insignia. He did not shoot himself. He did not make a final dramatic gesture. He surrendered. When the news reached Hitler's headquarters, the reaction was fury. Hitler could not understand it. He had given Paulus every reason to die: the promotion, the historical tradition, the direct expectation, and Paulus had chosen to live. What Hitler could not understand was that Paulus had spent months watching his men die for decisions he knew were wrong. He had watched 300,000 soldiers be sacrificed on the altar of Hitler's ego and Hitler's refusal to accept military reality. He had asked repeatedly for permission to save them and been denied repeatedly. And in that basement in Stalingrad, surrounded by the ruins of everything his obedience had built, Friedrich Paulus made the first independent decision of his military career. He chose to live. Soviet captivity was not comfortable, but Paulus was treated with the specific attention that the Soviets reserved for high-value prisoners. He was housed reasonably well, given access to books and newspapers, allowed to correspond with his family. The Soviets understood that a captured German field marshal was a propaganda asset of enormous value, if he could be turned. The turning took time. Paulus was not immediately cooperative. He maintained the bearing of a German officer for months. But as time passed, as he received news of how the war was going, the continued German defeats, the enormous casualties, the increasingly obvious fact that Germany was going to lose, something shifted. In 1944, Paulus joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners of war and exiled German communists that broadcast anti-Nazi propaganda into Germany. He began making radio broadcasts, calling on German soldiers to stop fighting, calling on commanders to disobey orders, arguing that continued resistance was pointless and was only costing German lives for a lost cause. From Hitler's perspective, this was the ultimate betrayal. A field marshal, the highest rank in the German military, broadcasting enemy propaganda, telling German soldiers to surrender, actively working to undermine the war effort. Hitler stripped Paulus of his rank, had his wife arrested, threatened his family. None of it stopped the broadcasts. After Germany's surrender in 1945, Paulus remained in Soviet captivity. He testified at the Nuremberg trials, appearing as a surprise witness for the Soviet prosecution, giving testimony about the planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union and about the decision-making that led to the Stalingrad disaster. His appearance in the Nuremberg courtroom was a sensation. A German field marshal testifying for the prosecution, describing how the German military leadership had planned and executed a war of aggression. He remained in Soviet custody until 1953, 8 years after the war ended. When he was finally released, he went not to West Germany, but to East Germany, to Dresden in the Soviet zone, where he lived under the protection and surveillance of the East German state. He spent his final years in Dresden writing his memoirs, giving occasional interviews, living quietly under a regime that was in many ways the ideological heir of the Soviet system that had captured him. He was rehabilitated in the East German narrative, the field marshal who had seen through Hitler, who had turned against the Nazi regime, who represented the possibility of a different Germany. He died on February 1st, 1957, 14 years after his surrender at Stalingrad, 12 years after the war ended. He was 66 years old. The debate about Friedrich Paulus is one that has never been fully resolved. Critics point out that he followed Hitler's orders obediently for years, that he led his army into the Stalingrad trap without pushing back hard enough on decisions he knew were wrong, that his transformation into an anti-Nazi figure happened only after he was in Soviet captivity and had lost everything. They argue that his conversion was convenient rather than principled, that a man who had served the regime faithfully through its years of conquest and atrocity does not become a moral figure simply because he ended up on the losing side. Defenders point out that he did surrender rather than forcing his remaining men to die for nothing, that his broadcasts, whatever their motivation, may have saved some German lives by encouraging surrender rather than suicidal resistance, that the decision to testify at Nuremberg, whatever the Soviet pressure behind it, put him on the record against the regime he had served. Both perspectives have merit. Both are incomplete. What we can say with certainty is this: Friedrich Paulus spent his career in perfect obedience to a system that was leading Germany and Europe to catastrophe. He was good at his job. He was thorough, professional, competent. And all of that competence was placed in service of a regime that used it to plan and execute a war that killed tens of millions of people. In a frozen basement in Stalingrad in January 1943, surrounded by the ruins of 300,000 men's lives, he made one decision that broke with a lifetime of obedience. Whether that decision makes him a tragic figure or a man who simply ran out of options, that is something each person who looks at this story has to decide for themselves. The 91,000 men who surrendered with him, most of them died in Soviet captivity. Only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. Paulus outlived almost all of them. That is the story of Friedrich Paulus, the field marshal who surrendered at Stalingrad, the prisoner who broadcast against Hitler, the witness who testified at Nuremberg, and the man who spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of what his obedience had cost. Thank you for watching. If this video gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach more people, and for stories this complicated, that genuinely matters. Subscribe because we cover these histories every single week, and we never take the easy way out. Drop a name in the comments if there is someone from this era you want us to cover next. We read every single one. See you in the next video.